How old are your children?
My daughter is 8, and then I've got 2 sons, 2 and 4.
Ooh, little ones.
Yeah. Yeah. Lots of fun, but they keep you on your toes.
Absolutely, and you're probably doing homeschooling as well.
Yeah. So just to start, will you please state your name?
Louise Comfort.
Okay. And will you tell me a bit about your professional background?
Well, my degrees are in political science, and in graduate school, I became very interested in decision-making under uncertainty, and that was the critical time. Now, I hate to tell you, I was in graduate school in the 60s, so this dates me, but it was a time, not unlike this, when maybe honestly even a little more extreme, when the world seemed like it was falling apart. And I was in political science and looking at people, especially in public service, who were facing situations they'd never seen before. They needed to do something. They didn't know what to do, but they had to act. And so I became very interested in what sorts of information they used. Where did they get their information? How was that shaped? And how did the information available to them shape the alternatives for action that they took? Then when I got my degree, I was, left New Haven, the East Coast, and was in California. So I started teaching in the California State University system, and I was teaching in a master's program in public administration, and this was the terminal degree for police, anyone who wanted to be a police chief or a fire chief or public works chief, people in the public services. And so this is also California, where it's called the state of disasters, right? There are earthquakes, there are floods, there are wildfires, there are, moonflies or sometimes agricultural pests. And so these students of mine were dealing with emergency plans. How to do this emergency plan? The chief handed it to me. How do I fill out this emergency plan? And so I thought, well, I better learn about this. And in the state university system, the faculty are state employees. And that means each faculty member needs to declare an area of public service. And at the time, and I still am, living in a house that is half a mile from the Hayward Fault, the Hayward earthquake. And I thought, oh, well, I better declare emergency services as my area of public service. And what that means is when any state agency comes up against a problem that it needs some assistance with, they can reach out to the state university and ask for someone on the faculty to assist them with those services. So for the 6 plus years that I was teaching in the state university system, I was a consultant for the California Office of Emergency Services, and I helped them plan their exercises and, work with the chiefs as they went through their various meeting the criteria that they needed to be certified. So that was the basic beginning. And then, of course, in California, the earthquakes roll through all the time. I became very much interested in, when you study earthquakes, they happen every 40 to 60 years in any one location, but about 100 around the world. So my first international earthquake was the Mexico City earthquake in 1985. And so it was also a time, and here is a shout out to the National Science Foundation, because the National Science Foundation had just started this program of, quick response grants. And I had gotten one early. It was, maybe only a year or two old, and I had gotten maybe the second ever to study the Pennsylvania tornadoes in 1980, in the spring of 1985. I just finished that study when the Mexico City earthquake occurred. I applied for another and went to Mexico City. And then fascinated with earthquakes because it's the civilian equivalent of war in a city. Anything underground breaks, so water, electrical power, telephone communications lines, gas lines, sewer lines, transportation, all of the lifelines that make a city function are often damaged in earthquakes. And so the interaction and the interdependencies of these response systems made coordination very difficult. And then, of course, earthquakes are very sudden. In California, you get 5 seconds, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 notice. And almost anywhere else, there are, no notice events. So the burden really falls on the managers. And what is also clear is that if the managers are prepared, if they know their city and their resources and their areas, the decisions they make in the first hour, literally, will shape the trajectory of the response and affect very much the recovery process. So, it then went from Mexico City to San Salvador to Ecuador to Costa Rica and back to California 2-3 times, and around the world. I've actually done 23 response studies in 14 different countries.
Wow.
So that's been the primary focus of my research. But it's still decision-making under uncertainty. What do people do when they're in a situation they've never seen before and they've got to do something? And my last book that came out was published a year ago, and looked at 12 of those earthquake response systems, was done, all of these earthquakes were between 1999 and the last one that I did was the Nepal earthquake in 2015. But it was the time of great expansion in information technology. So communication was much more frequent. And, in Nepal, people were communicating on cell phones, with people in the Kathmandu Valley. And that was just very, very different from Mexico City when, the telephone landlines went down, people were without communication. So that's a very short capsule. In between, I did hurricanes and, a tornado or two. And so it's been really looking at extreme events.
So you've answered the next question, which was, when and how did you get involved with research on disasters?
Oh,
so
living next to the earthquake club, actually.
And it sounds like you're specializing mostly in earthquakes. Is that true?
Well,
or would you?
I focus, when you're in this field, you really have to focus on something. And I focused on earthquakes because for me, it was the major hazard, the one that created the most impact on metropolitan areas. It was also the most complex, and it was filled with interdependencies. And it's not just the earthquake, it's what you do when the transportation systems go down, when the power goes out. And, each of these failures triggers other failures. So you get the cascading failures that occur. And then these are long-term events that create long-term consequences, and also it's very expensive, right? Because it's the entire infrastructure of the city. And most of the time, if people build cities, and as they did in the 1950s, 60s in California, many of the cities expanded rapidly during the Second World War and after the Second World War. And a lot of the builders weren't thinking about earthquakes. So there were all kinds of unreinforced masonry buildings. There were all kinds of school buildings that were not reinforced. And so California as a state, as they began recognizing, good grief, there's almost not a single place in California that you can build that's not on an earthquake fault. And so really redesigning the building codes, retrofitting not only the building. There used to be a very grim joke in California. If you want to know where the earthquake faults are, look for the schools and the hospitals. And the reason was because the earthquake faults, the developers then began to know where the earthquake faults were, so the land was cheaper. And so cities thinking, oh, this land is cheaper, we'll build our school right here, right on top of the earthquake fault. And, for example, the Hayward Fault runs right through the campus of the University of California at Berkeley.
Wow. That's
and fortunately, some of the very best earthquake engineers study at Berkeley and seismologists, and they finally got the attention of the regions, and so there have been major retrofits of the buildings at Berkeley. But, literally, California has had to retrofit many of its buildings, and now, the earthquake codes in California are among the highest, strongest in the world. Probably California and Japan have the best earthquake codes.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Wow. So my next question is, and you may have already answered this with your answer about Mexico City, is there one seminal disaster event for you that really shaped your thinking about disaster research?
Mexico City, absolutely. I had been trained in, strict, linear, quantitative research. At Yale, they wouldn't let you out of the graduate program unless you could do multiple regression 87 different ways. My own dissertation was a causal model. We did surveys and survey analysis, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so when I went to Mexico City, I had not only this little quick response grant, but fortunately, because it was the first big international earthquake and had gotten a lot of attention, and it was so close to California and so close to the U.S., that I also received a National Research Council grant. I have money from my university, so I had money to design and do a survey, and I worked with colleagues in Mexico City at a town university, and we developed a team. I developed a set of questions, and we trained the team, and, I was there, and I got the results back. It did not make sense. I said, I was there. I know these things didn't happen. Something's wrong. And I went back, I looked at it again, I recalculated and recoded it, et cetera, et cetera. It still didn't make sense. My son was studying at Cornell University at the time. He was in graduate school. And he said, Mom, it's a complex system. Complex system? What do you mean? I said, it's a complex adaptive system. It's nonlinear. You've got interdependencies that are in there. And I thought, oh, kids. you know, he doesn't really understand. And so this was September. He came back, and he was home at Thanksgiving, and he asked me, so, how's the analysis of Mexico City going? Ethan, I can't make sense out of it. It doesn't really do anything. And, it doesn't fit what I saw. And he looked at me again and said, Mom, it's a complex system. And here, and he handed me a whole set of books on Prigogine Stengers, complex adaptive systems. And so I read, and actually I spent the next summer in the physics library of the University of Pittsburgh studying complex systems and trying to figure out the equations, etc. And so that event really shifted. And when I began looking at it this way, then the data fell in place. Then I could see and understand that one system led to the next system and the decisions that they made led to the next system, and if they were here, it triggered another reaction. And so I was tracing then the interactions among the organizations, not the rules that they said that they were doing, because in the surveys, they were responding exactly to the questions that I asked, and they were responding by what the rules said. But I had been there, and I had seen they weren't following the rules. And not only that, but the rules didn't fit the situation. So only then could I see that it was the interaction among the organizations. And again, and this came back to what I've already been interested in, was the flow of information among the organizations, and where the breaks came, literally in coordination, were often the breaks in the communication flow. So it was who was able to communicate to whom, and where the breaks, occurred would shape the response system. So that really transformed my thinking about decision-making in dynamic situations. And I began then looking at networks and interacting networks and how networks perform together and how networks often work. And this fit, actually Henry Quarantelli's spontaneous emergent groups, but bringing a network approach to it and then bringing the analytics of networks and being able to measure the interactions made it much stronger. So that really significantly changed my approach to understanding networks in rapidly changing urgent events.
Okay. Wow. So that's
I have kids.
Yeah.
The little ones will grow up, and they'll teach you too.
Oh yeah. You mentioned that you just finished off a book, and perhaps this was the focus of your research before COVID-19. What was the focus of your research before COVID-19, and were you engaged in a particular study?
Well, in COVID-19, we also formed one of these little working groups under Lori Peake's Converge program. And in COVID-19, since I've done all the work on earthquakes, and also since my faculty position, I'm still on the faculty part-time at the University of Pittsburgh, but I was in a graduate school of public and international affairs, so I had international students. And when COVID-19 occurred, and my students who graduated and then went back to their countries and became professors in their own right in their own countries. And so I just sent emails. Some of them sent emails to me saying, Dr. Gumper, look what's happening. And then I reached out to them, and they said, well, we ought to do something. And Lori sent out her announcement, form a working group. So we had literally a ready-made working group of students that were in China, Japan, Korea, Italy, Ireland, Turkey. We a couple of others volunteered from Idris Alam from the UAE, and we had loui from Halifax. But it was, almost a ready-made, very spontaneous, and emergent group straight out of the sociology literature. And we were looking at, of course, decision-making. And one of the things that came from, these 33 years of research on earthquakes, where there's a gap between recognizing the risk and acting on that risk. And actually, in sociology, psychology, people have recognized that gap. And it's one of the things that I think is really critical, especially in urgent events, is to get people to act more quickly. And it was one of the things that I saw painfully in Japan, where people waited to be told what to do. They waited to be told by the local government or the local police. And there were times in Japan where people died waiting for a medical doctor or a fire truck to come. And so, the major lesson from the work that I did over 32 years is really how can we shorten the gap? How can we trigger, informed action? How can you enable not only individuals but a whole community to recognize the risk and realize in this situation they need to act together? In COVID-19, I saw the same problem. And it is this collective cognition when the whole community recognizes the risk and then they take the collective action to reduce that risk. In COVID-19, it's harder. An earthquake, the bridge falls down, the building collapses, it's pretty evident that you got to do something. COVID-19, you can't see it. And so you really, the information and messaging is really critical. And it became very apparent very quickly that the different countries were recognizing this risk at different rates and were able to elicit collective action also at different rates. So you have China, and they use a very authoritarian top-down approach, but they lock it down and they essentially stop transmission of the virus. You see Korea, and they use a voluntary approach, but, very extensive use of technology, so they're following everybody around and they're saying, okay, we see you, we reach out to this person, etc. But you have Asian cultures that are much more collective cultures. And then you see the U.S. with mixed messaging, Trump, I'm not going to wear a mask, and it becomes politicized. And then look at the consequences, with literally more than 3 million cases and 140,000 deaths. And so COVID-19 to me exemplifies in such powerful ways this connection between recognizing the risk in an informed way and acting collectively in an informed way. And here we got very different responses between the states. So in California, the governor has taken a very strong, very consistent approach, and literally the entire state, people are wearing their masks and, staying apart, doing social distancing. And early California was able to bring the count down. It's a little too close to Arizona and to Mexico City. And so the cases came into Imperial County, and then from Imperial County to Los Angeles. And Los Angeles, I think, opened up. It was kind of poignant because Los Angeles has all, public, it's the largest city in the state. but all the universities and university campuses, State University, University of California at Los Angeles, all of these students had virtual graduation. So in June, after the virtual graduation, and the governor said, okay, very slowly you can open up. Then they all had graduation parties, and they all went to the beach, and the count went up. And so, Los Angeles, then the mayor, shut everything down again. But, it's a really incredibly difficult thing where even though people were following the rules, they didn't understand that, especially I think, this is critical for young people because they tended to have either no symptoms or mild symptoms, but they didn't really think they were sick. And of course, they spread it, and then all of their grandmothers and aunts and uncles, of course, got it. So, but it's, in any case, the problem in COVID-19 is essentially the same as transmission. How do you recognize the risk? What are the signals? And what kinds of information do you seek to base your actions on? And so, the emphasis, and I really give kudos to Governor Newsom of California because he early partnered with the public health, the California Department of Public Health, and also California is, maybe ahead of most states because every single one of its 58 counties has a health department. And these are people that are trained, and each county has its own emergency operations center for public health. And so I think California has a stronger administrative network than maybe most states. But it also needs it because, it's got 40 million people and it's trying to manage it. But in any case, this was the problem we were looking at, and we were very pleased. We put together a short paper. It got published in the Public Administration Review, which, it's one of the leading journals of the paper. And now we're actually submitting a research proposal to the National Science Foundation for a research coordination network. So we hope to keep this network alive.
Okay.